It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Judith Issroff. We're here in your beautiful home in the Castel, Adversary in Israel. And Judith, you come from South Africa. If you can tell us a little bit about your background, your family.
Oh, well, fine. Thank you. I was born in Port Elizabeth at the hospital they've just burnt down, and I'm from the Eastern Cape, which is where my grandfather landed when he came in around 1890, or just before the turn of the century. He returned there, leaving his family behind, and he came, like many Jews, to escape pogroms of Catherine the Great and enforced conscription when they were taking Jewish boys who were approaching bar mitzvah age and taking them into the Russian army and sending them to the opposite end of Russia, anywhere, for 25 years or so, forced conscription, from the area around Shavli, which was part of the Kovna and Vilna areas, in pretty well Topol country, from the Fiddler on the Roof, that's on my father's side, and on my mother's, in Lithuania, of course. But my mother's side, she came from the Suwalka Gdynia, Mariupol area, all that area of Poland, where my grandmother, Rachelea, and her mother, Sarah Witkowski, we actually have genealogical. My brother Saul Issroff, also a Wits graduate, 1964 medical school, and a skin specialist originally, but now a Jewish genealogist, and he has published several books on South African Jewish history and articles and African history of Jews in encyclopedias, and you should definitely talk to him. He's a Holocaust study, and he has a library second to none. He wrote, and I'll show you here, the Book of the Dead, the numbers of Jews who died in our family area in the Shoah. We know of 68 members on my father's side, and who knows how many on my mother's side, but on her side, from Mariupol, firstly, my grandmother and my grandfather both got professions, and at a very young age, 19 and 21, they decided to escape via the Jewish Aid Society, coming to the East End of London, and because my grandmother had family that had my grandfather was a gambler. They first lived in Norwich in England, where, of course, in the cathedral, I was pretty shocked when I first went there to find that this Jewish blood libel still existed, but the Sheriff of Nottingham, and this was quite recently, and I think the pamphlet is still there, one of my cousins told me. So my mother was actually born in England, and came to South Africa and she met my father, who was a very, by that stage, a very well-established bachelor in his early 40s, and she was first looked over by members of her family. My father had been trying to rescue family members that he'd grown up with, because he came to South Africa when he was age 7. And my first awareness of the Holocaust as a very precocious child who read extensively from the age of 4 under the covers at night, and ever since, was that in Port Elizabeth we had a stopping point for naval ships, and we hosted in our house various injured British pilots and seamen from naval ships. And my father had a whole coterie of Jews from Eastern Europe of every sort, some distinguished pianists, some physicists, Adolf Hallis, for instance, some very, well, there were all sorts, comedians, Eddie Jacobson, all of them Shoah survivors, but before that, the troops that used to come and they used to try to, my father had travelled and was at the Berlin Olympics, and that was the last time he saw most of his family when he went back to visit Linkova and Shavli and the area around where the Vilna Gaon was, because that's the area we lived in. And he was very aware of anti-Semitism, and he bought, in 1945, he bought a little painting which he brought home, and he told my brother and I that this was, he'd bought it from a penniless, starving, gaunt man who he also brought home to feed. My mother never knew how many people he would bring home, and there were always big parties, and I used to listen to the conversations, and it was painted with the man's some dirt, dust, blood, and charcoal from charred things that he made, and it said Arbeit macht frei on it, and there were stick figures. And this painting was kept until my mother donated it to a bargain sale for the Keren Kayemet Israel. We always had the box for the Keren Kayemet Israel, into which we put our pennies, and we received prizes when we filled our boxes, and our father told us that he had been trying to trace whether any of his family survived. And here in Israel, one survivor I met when her name was Silber at that stage. She'd married a man called Five-ish Silber. after the war, she'd seen her first husband clubbed to death. She'd seen her sister. No, her first husband was executed. Her sister was clubbed to death, and my brother started making this Book of the Dead, and I had read to him to translate from the Yiddish, from the Hebrew, the Lithuanian Jewish Holocaust Survivors Society in Israel. They have their cemetery in Chulon, and they had their center in Chulon. And I met other survivors, like the chocolate-making family who were in Chulon, and also found for my cousin, whom I then met, who had survived Stutthof and other extermination camps. She had worked also in Dora. And I remember when the State of Israel was declared. We were living then in Durban because my father died shortly after he showed us these pictures. My brother was just 4, and I was about to turn 6. I was still 5. No, I was 6. In any event, and our mother had just lost a baby. She'd had full-blown eclampsia of pregnancy, eclampsia with fits, which I remember, and I heard the noise in the bathroom and called my father, who got her to hospital. And I remember the baby dying, and our mother was in a completely changed woman in a flat-out depression, just back from the hospital when my father died, and they didn't want to tell us or let us be at the funeral. But my mother did tell us, and I always linked it to him telling us about Arbeit macht frei, and we still had many I have many good memories, but my brother barely remembers anything, and I have excellent recall. I even have recall of my own premature birth, which was a bougie-induced birth. That's a kind of plant they put into the woman's womb from this tree, and it swells up and opens to open the mouth of the womb, and they give her oil bath and enema. My mother was so traumatized, and they also left a bit of placenta inside, and she got an infection, and she had septicemia, and she nearly died. And she was still in bed, still recovering, when my father had his heart attack after a wonderful day we spent at a Luna Park on the big wheel with him and on all the rides, dodgems and so on, in Port Elizabeth. So we had a wonderful childhood till that stage, which has meant that although all my family, all my cousins in England and in South Africa, so far as I'm concerned, and my brother, were very disturbed, completely crazy, a very eccentric family. My father's sisters, he had 3 sisters, were also, each in a different way, extremely disturbed women. And my poor grandmother on my father's side, Omar, a wonderful woman, you can see her portrait over there by Dorothy Kay, and that's a portrait which belongs in a museum. Her works are very well known in South Africa. She was our next door neighbour, and we used to play with her children. Do you want to stop and take a picture of it? You might as well take the picture behind the, it's a wood-burning stove. That's by Volkskenk, and that's the mountains and the sort of scenery of the area of the Cape, with wonderful, wonderful sunrises and sunsets that I grew up with. He was the neighbouring farm to my father, who was very much a self-made man.
What type of work did your father do?
He was a farmer. I'm actually a farmer's daughter, and it's very much in my blood. And when I came here, I wanted to plant, as my grandmother had made an orchard, which I remember very well from this place where they ended up. It was called Hankey. It's the remaining steam engine, and it's in the valley named after the Reverend John Phillips of the Dutch East India Company, who, when I remember asking Visa Lantes hier, and somebody on whose land is this, and somebody answering, this Johnson has a Hottentot. And there were the Hottentot country, everybody. It was the last part of South Africa that needed integration. Everybody went to school together, and I saw it. White, black, coloured, Hottentots, bush people, there was one, and it's like 100 miles inland from Hermanus. And the steam engine is still there. It's worth going to visit. And there was a mountain. There was a Jewish doctor, like in many places, and my father went 15 kilometers miles then, on horseback with his sisters to get to school. And I met his school teacher, and with my mother at the height of apartheid, and with my aunt who had gone to school there. And there was great embracing. And my grandfather, after whom I was named, Yehuda ben Shlomo ben Shimon ben Israel. I mean, my father, David ben Yehuda ben, more Jewish you can't be. And as I say, my brother traces the genealogy way back, I think, to one of the sons of Aaron or Reuben or somebody. He's the one you should interview on all of this. He has it exactly all tabled and written down, and he's a big macher in the Jewish Genealogical Society, and an historian. He's written the history of African Jewry and South African Jewry in the encyclopedias, and there are entries by him and various other learned journals. And he should never have done medicine, and nor should I, but it was the best background. It's always, I've kept updated, but I really I fainted the first operation I ever saw at the age of 15. I fainted subsequently during operations. I never could stand blood. I did everything. And the best thing I ever did was to change from being a psychoanalyst, because I thought that the interaction between people was the most important thing. It was clearly the most important thing. And on that, because this patient, I remember, we were doing ward rounds. I did well at medical school. I was a top scholar, and the scholarships every year for doing many extracurricular activities. I thrived once I got away from school, Transvaal matriculation certificate, and at the height of apartheid, which I could never understand, I always on the farm wondered, why did I have to wear shoes? Why couldn't I be barefoot like the Pekingese? I used to go and sneak off and try to help them, make the mud from the cow dung mixtures and smear the walls and paint the lovely pictures. So we were in Nedabele, and the tribal people that Nelson Mandela came from.
Xhosa.
Xhosa. And I also learned from our Sutu, my mother's maid, beloved Teresa. I learned the 3 kinds of clicks, and how to make them from her son when he came to London. And I went with her to church, and I went with her to Kew to get her passport done, and I was a very fierce opponent of apartheid. My brother was arrested along with Adam Cooper and Stan Cohen, who it's sad you cannot interview.
Can I ask, did your family have a connection with Jan Kolovitz?
Who?
Jan Kolovitz?
I don't
He was
know.
a lawyer in Port Elizabeth that helped
yes, I've
Becky
heard of him. Saul might know of him. We were with the Olympic marathon champion. No, the 4-minute mile man. He was from Port Elizabeth, and he wanted to marry one of my cousins, Dinky, Jermaine Goldberg, who was married to Max Goldberg, who was related to Jaime Moros of the Jaime Moros Psychiatric Center, or Center for Treating War Traumatized People. If you ask me what I am, I'm a very traumatized traumatologist, but I'm also a psychoanalyst, a very kosher psychoanalyst. I'm a fellow and was a training analyst in the British Institute for Psychoanalysis and the British Psychotherapy Society. I'm the quintessential, original, fully trained at the most prestigious in those days, original Tavistock Centre Institute for Public Health and Education, and the Tavistock School of Family Psychiatry and mental health, before all the controversies which have nothing to do with that lot which are happening at present.
Judith, can I just ask, when you applied for medicine at Wits University, was it difficult to be accepted?
I had no problem. I had an A aggregate, which I always knew I'd get in. And I really wanted to know about it because I wanted to know about death and dying. That was my motivation. I think it's absolutely silly that nobody ever asks about the motivation for why people go into particular professions. But I needed to understand death and dying. People were dying on me from a very early age. Both my sisters, my mother had a miscarriage, and interestingly, when she died and I was with her all the way, she hallucinated one of the last things, and she said she'd had such a peculiar dream. And this peculiar dream, I said, but that's what happened. She was dancing with my father, and she started bleeding, and they were at the floor at a big party they were giving for New Year or Christmas or something, at the Elizabeth Hotel in Port Elizabeth in Summer Strand, connected with Happy Valley. And I said, but it happens. And then she remembered. And she said, and then she remembered my, our baby sister who was unnamed's death. And then she said she now realizes how she's so relieved that she didn't have to, as a young widow of, she was just in her early 30s, that she didn't have 3 children to take care of, because my brother immediately developed asthma, and he used to dangle chicken legs and try to spook me and everyone, because he'd been told some silly story by one of our African staff about, or maybe it was Kathleen, who was educated in England, our English nanny, complete with hat, and because we were very indulged children, the most wonderfully indulged children. We were always either with our mother on the beach playing, or decorating, or in the kitchen making sandwiches and snacks and licking bowls, or we were with or helping her in the garden, or we were with our father on different farms. And I've many pictures, actually, many, so no problem in illustrating all of this. And my brother is at present getting all the photographs onto some sort of album, which should be receiving. But this is a very important story. When my father was 14, either 12 or 14, his father went to Oudtshoorn to sell his ostrich feathers. It was the time everybody wore ostrich feathers. And he made money. He was farming fruit trees in this valley, returning to the valley. And it was a very interesting valley ecologically. It's got the meeting of different. It's kind of like Mitzpe Ramon in terms of its ecological interest, or some of our very national parks where ancient things are, because it has a special aloe called Aloe daviensis. Red hot pokers was its common name. I had some in the garden, and it has also mimosas and proteas, special proteas, but mainly cacti. It's kind of like the cactuses, special cactus gardens. We had a couple of places in Israel with people who bought those, and I had a cactus garden here, but I can't cope with scratches and thorns, and it overgrew, and it's gone. Like the fruit trees, the 2 of everything, that my grandmother had built, each of which would, the roots of which would have destroyed the house, and that's why all my wonderful trees are gone. They grew too big and they shaded things, and the neighbors cut them down, and it's just a pity, because I had just the most fabulous garden here. Well, you can still see the outline. But it's had 7 years of Shemitah at present, so nothing's left of it. And as I said before, you know, we can smell the beautiful mimosa, the beautiful wisteria at present, and some honeysuckle, but the bougainvillea isn't all out yet, and it's looking very neglected. And those trees, we had cycads, and we had huge palms, because Reverend John Phillips got 2 gangs of different tribes on either side of a mountain, and they dug a tunnel. It took 4 years, and it met, and he brought water into this valley, and the branch of the river is where my grandfather built his farm, up on a hill with all the red hot pokers behind, and he was a shochet, and he could do a Brit Milah, and every Pesach and every Chag, for that matter, every time there was a Jewish holiday, all the various Jews, all of whom had come penniless and walked and gone to a different little outpost and started a little farm and started peddling from their back and specialized into something and built, and that's how the whole of South Africa developed. From diamonds, when they struck it, to the gold mine reefs, to the whole of the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape and Cape Town to this day. Property development, vineries, and you can read it all in the books I started on very, very early.
Was your family traditional? Was it a very traditional family?
Well, we kept Friday nights, and everybody came for Friday nights, and traditional foods, absolutely. I've got here Claudia Dan's Jewish cookbook, the treasures, of Jewish cookery from all around the world, which is more like an anthropology book. But I've got a handwritten book by my mother of all my grandmother's recipes, both sides, and hers, and she collected them. And my earliest memories of running around, my mother running after my grandmother saying, "But how much, Ma? How much?" And my mother saying, my grandmother, who didn't, till it looked right, so much, and so on. And she made all the traditional dishes, saltenoches, and those were cheese blintzes. I remember helping her make cheese, hanging up in a muslin, and both my grandmothers knew how to make cheese. On the other side, my mother's side, my grandmother, who came from Witkowskis and Kolokowskis, Kolakowski, and the Prince Kolakowski, and his Rita Senior, maybe. We Polish philosophers also. The Muslim, and my grandmother, this grandmother, Oma, she taught me cheese making, butter making, pancake making, teglach making, rugelach making. We used to plait our teglach and stuff it and she used to add sherry, and she used to add blackberries and blueberries and raisins, and they were crisp and they were glazed and they were sticky, and sometimes you decorated them with hundreds and thousands or as well. They were spectacular. But my aunt, they called her Dickie. Everybody had nicknames. Aunt Rebecca, my father's eldest, he was the eldest, and then came Rebecca Dickie, Duck, who was Sheila, and Barbie, the baby, Sarah, who was really stupid woman, but cunning, who was my brother's godmother, and she and I detested each other because I used to run away from her, and I called her names and I teased her, and she only produced one daughter who she did nothing but feed, while not giving any of the rest of us food. And she took all the family treasures, and she destroyed my letters to my grandmother, because when my brother got asthma, we were told to go inland, and we went first to that place where they had, it was very dry, and they had a big, it was called in those days a loony bin, and they kept psychiatric monstrous prisoners in cages. And my brother and I went for a walk. I remember it was sort of Highveld, Louis Tricard, I think it was called, or near Grahamstown. And we saw these prisoners, but we also saw, they also had a slaughterhouse where they slaughtered animals. That was our first introduction, completely horrified, seeing animals being killed for food. And they were decapitating chickens who were running around without heads and blood spurting everywhere. So this was another extremely traumatic event for us.
And how old were you at this time when you saw
7.
this? It's very traumatic.
Shocking. And my brother 5. Well, he wasn't yet 5. I think, no, I was 6 and he was 4. Ever so traumatic. And this was on top of all the deaths that had just happened.
So you applied for medical school because you wanted to understand more about death?
Oh, sure.
And when you were in medical school, were there many other females?
Yes, there were. There was Pat Brooks, who was the daughter of the Queen's physician, who was from India, and she was a half caste, and she was pretending to be white, and she was always worried about her complexion. And she told me all this in London years later. And we were the last year that Wits was a university before it became a white tribal college. Basically, it was a white tribal college. We marched against apartheid, and my brother happened to be in the front row and was arrested, along with Adam and Stanley Cohen, both very distinguished men now. I think I had mumps at the time. No, I did march. Well, I couldn't march because I was still infectious. I got all the childhood diseases as soon as I got to medical school, or just before.
And were you overlapped? Were you 2 years difference, but you were in medical school together with your brother?
He came after me.
Yeah.
He came 2 years after me. He's 22 months younger than me. Or he came 3 years after me.
What year did you start medical school?
I started in 56.
So it's really at the height of apartheid.
Oh boy, was it the height of apartheid. But it was such a relief to get out of school. I was so bored at school.
But Wits Medical School...
No, I don't mean medical school. I mean Parktown Girls High School for Girls.
Judith, could you tell us a little bit more about medical school? Because Wits Medical School was one of the top in the world.
At that stage, I think Wits Medical School was absolutely excellent. And it was a great privilege to be there, though we didn't realize it at the time. I told you it was the last year. It was a university and not a white tribal college. We didn't know at the time that one George of Huhu, one of the 2 or 3 black people there, and son of one of the, I think, Zulu, well, some tribal chief, was actually the Broederbond sponsored spy in the class. It was very difficult for those of us who were active in resistance and underground. I was, in a very minor kind of a way, mainly responsible for keeping African adult education open in Johannesburg. I was the class representative of the student council from 2nd or 3rd year. I got ill several times during my medical school career, and I actually only did 5 years, and I should never have been let through because I missed practically the whole of 5th year, I think it was. Because I had hepatitis, and then I got it again. I did the professorial jobs, invitation jobs at Johannesburg General Hospital. I didn't know that I was reported while I was trying to make up. I was back on my feet, and I was with a woman called Norma Siegel. You asked about a woman. Norma was my very good friend, and she was also at Part-Time Girls High School, and she and I couldn't do sport. I had injured my back when I was about 9 or 11 years old, when we were on holiday in the Magaliesberg Mountains near Sterkfontein Caves, and we climbed some mountain near one of the resorts, and I saw my brother or someone as if about to go over a cliff, and went running to get him, and went over and slid down myself down some cliff, and I still have...
You still have the scar?
I still have a scar, you can see it, and hurt my arm and tore muscles, and I actually put my back out, but I had... we then moved to Durban for a brief while, where I encountered anti-Semitism, where I was when the State of Israel was declared with Habonim, which were all boys and me. And I had to fight for my right to be there. They were teasing me because I was a girl. So I got knocked out, but I also had been at a girls' school in the Berea, which was called Durban Secondary High School for Girls. And I didn't want to kneel or go to morning mass. I think it was a Catholic school, nun school. And I was singled out as a Jewish girl to leave the hall. And some girls accosted me and told me, we were white uniform, beautiful white uniform, and berets and so on. And I was pushed into the gutter and told, you killed Jesus. And I said, well, nonsense. Jesus was a Jew. They told me I was a liar and beat me up, and I came home everything torn. And that was a real exposure to anti-Semitism. I also had trouble in Port Elizabeth. They tried to send me, soon after my father's death, to a collegiate school for girls. And I went with a woman called Louise Harris. She was an older girl, and she wanted nothing much to do with me, but I had to go with her because our fathers had been friends. Her aunt was one of the women who'd been in love with my father that he hadn't married, and she was under house arrest. And remember meeting with her and talking about him many years later. And my father's lawyer, Abe Kaplan, died 4 months after my father, and Anne Kaplan, who was a pretty remarkable woman, who was the secretary for mathematics in the making, and whose brother was a very distinguished professor in Oxbridge or All Souls, A.B. Kaplan, and an anthropologist, I think, of influence. Anne was, I learned afterwards from a man in England who lived opposite my cousin Faith, my mother's eldest sister. Mother was a sandwich between Dora and Hannah, her younger sister. And they only really took care of boys. Boys could go to school and get an education. My mother was forced to leave school because they couldn't afford to send 2 children to school, just when she got a scholarship to study art. And she never got over that, and she had to stand in the street any kind of weather at a market stall selling anything that they could take over and fix up and sell second hand. And she was most embarrassed about all of this and poverty. So for her, the comfort and luxury and South Africa was always paradise for her. She loved South Africa, and she loved Port Elizabeth and being someone. And she was a great hostess and a very gracious lady and a very good mother. My brother and I really bless her because we're the only ones who came out semi-sane. We're eccentric, but you know, we think for ourselves. And I've got a great art collection there, including books. My mother bought them as they came out and were sent from England. School.
Yeah, medical school. Do you remember your professors, heads of the departments?
Yes, I was very friendly with all of them, and it was thanks to Mosey Sussman that he said I was the only one that he'd ever recommended to go and train as a psychoanalyst. I'd never heard of Freud or anything. And I had walked out of psychiatry. We had some brilliant professors and excellent clinical training.
At Wits?
at Wits, and because I'd been ill and missed this year, I mean, a long line of different things, I was getting up from, I think, 8 months of hepatitis. I'd only had 3 weeks when I burst into tears at a ward round. Somebody touched my back and then proceeded to faint. I was carefully picked up by Jeff Maisels, Advocate Maisels' son, and Mickey Ronsel, who both Jeff and Mickey have made magnificent contributions, very famous. Jeff's here somewhere, I think, with his son on some kibbutz. His son became a rabbi. Mickey's still in his, what he calls his Medina, which is, he was head of neurology and dean of the faculty of medicine and sciences at Harvard. I mean, he couldn't do better than that. He's in Boston, Harvard, MIT, sailing his boat and walking all the little shops and everything. We had a lovely reunion. We used to support each other. I was telling you about activities in our class against apartheid.
This was when you were a student at Wits?
Yeah, well, in the first year, I went out with Michael Pickedy, who was actually a communist. So they didn't want to give me a passport, and they were watching me and the family, who were going hysterical. I went out with a lot of guys, brilliant guys, all of whom have made lots of things, and but Pickedy got me into real trouble. I only went out with them about 4 times, and I went to some of his meetings. Of course, I never became a communist. I mean, I disapprove strongly of communism. I'm a believer in, however flawed, in whatever democracy stands for, though it doesn't work. But I was telling you about keeping the night schools open with Martin Bobrow, Sir Martin Bobrow, Bart, knighted by the Queen and Fellow of the Royal Society, and a very important, distinguished person who married Jan Smuts' daughter or granddaughter, who also was at medical school a couple of years behind us. And I spent most of my time with them, and Dart liked me and picked me out because I was very angry with some damn fool, the Broederbond spy, who refused to dissect a black cadaver. Can you imagine? And I made a big speech, and Dart and somebody was teasing me, and they wanted me, because I came late, because I'd been to be a bridesmaid for one of my cousin's weddings in England, and I'd stopped in Turkey, and of course gone my way and not done anything more or less except the tickets between. I went with Maxine Berkowitz, whose brother Leonard also became a distinguished lawyer in England, and Maxine married an Israeli, and they emigrated to Indonesia, I don't know, somewhere, or Australia, and I met at the Tavistock when I got there all these very distinguished people, but I was here in Israel in 1967, which was a very different country, and it was 57, right, and went everywhere, and I got hepatitis again then. And I went to Sodom then, and I went to Eilat then, which was just a few huts, but on the old roads. And I happen to be also, one of my professions is I'm an Israeli trained official tourist guide. The best thing I ever did, and it was a great year, we had a lawyer, we had a man who spoke 17 languages, we had Israel's top ecologist, we had journalist, we had a rabbi who got stuck crawling in caves in Beit Jivrin, holes, you know, with the Ma'arechet that I used to love. But you had to go on your stomach, and he was a bit stout. We had an expert from Yale on pre-Islamic tribes and cultures. We had the secretary of Shamir, and who had worked for Begin's wife before. We had a whole group of officers, corps, who had come out of the army. We had it was an amazing year, and it was just as good a sort of basic introduction to many languages as is medical school, because in medical school you get a smattering of something. But the best thing for us was Dart, Tobias, Paul Levy, Sid Brenner. You know, these are all international distinguished names, and they were all suitors of my cousin Helene, Pussy, daughter of Duck, an American called Bully for good reason, and Neville Katzen, who played tennis for South Africa, and I played with Abe Siegel and Neville Katzen, and who was it? Somebody else who was a South African doubles champion, and Ian Froman. Ian Froman was in my class. Who's a dentist. Loved Ian, and he set up all the tennis here in, you know, in the World Tennis Association and the courts here. But unfortunately, he died. He came to visit me.
Judith, when you qualified in medicine, did you ever practice as a medical doctor?
All the time. I still do. I'm offering advice all the time.
But did you have a private practice with patients?
No, I'm a psychoanalyst. Why should I? I practiced as a psychoanalyst for all my life till I couldn't afford to pay the insurance and didn't want to anymore.
And where did you do your speciality in psycho?
In England, at the British Royal College, Her Majesty's Royal College of Psychoanalysis and Institute of Psychoanalysis, as it was known first. And then it became an Institute of Psychotherapy, and it was an international body. I'm qualified internationally as well as in England. Look, I've got a list of degrees. I'll try to write them all down for you. But I don't succeed. But because my career took many zigzags.
Can I just ask, with regard to Wits, did you ever encounter any anti-Semitism when you were at Wits?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
In the medical school or in the university itself?
Both.
Really?
Yes, but I encountered, I was reported as a yurt. Anne van Heerden, who was the daughter of the head of the main Broederbond newspaper, Die Vaderland, she had a berry aneurysm in her circle of Willis. She married an Afrikaans friend of mine. I'd grown up in this sheltered little Jewish community. I didn't know goyim really, very few at school, where Jewish girls were a special little bunch. But I encountered anti-Semitism, I told you first, really badly in Durban, where I was beaten up, and then I fell in love with, I moved to Durban North Junior High School, where I fell in love instantly with a boy who lived down the road called Brian Kelly, and he was killed in his first solo flight. Thank you. And I thought that we left Durban because I was so friendly with a Goy. And we loved each other, and we used to do acrobatics, and we used to do chemical experiments up in my room. I had a beautiful room at the top of the house overlooking the whole bay with the moonlight and marvelous sunsets and sunrises and exquisite electrical excuse me please, electrical storms. And we used to take our bikes, him and I and a boy called Dale Cutts, who used to tag along, who lived nearby, and we used to ride out into the sugarcane fields. And there were snakes, so, and we used to get sugarcane raw and bring it back. And we had a big and wonderful garden in Durban. We also had a stepsister who was half Malaysian, because my stepfather, who we chose because he played soccer and wasn't boring and regretted instantly, he had this daughter Denise, his name was Isidore Lieberman, and he was wealthy, and my mother gave everything she got from him, everything away. She didn't want anything that reminded her of him. He wanted her to have more children. She certainly didn't. My brother had asthma attacks every night and nearly died. And Denise kept making suicide attempts, as her mother had committed suicide, and she was brought home from boarding school. And he was terrible to her and was always losing his temper and screaming at all of us. And I felt sorry for her, and I was very pleased to have a sister. And I used to talk with her and sit in her bed, and I used to climb up. I was always climbing onto rooftops and reading and hiding from people. Used to climb onto this honeysuckle covered, beautiful little rooftop over, it was a sort of little washing room or gardening tool shed or something, and looked down, and we had one of those storks or tick birds or herons, blue heron I think it was, that lived in the garden. We had a peacock. We had rows of papayas, pawpaw trees. We always had fresh pawpaw for breakfast, and we had mango trees. I loved mangoes. My mother hated them. They were so messy. But boy, they were tasty. And we kept rabbits. We had a gardener, and we had the houseboy who had come from Mozambique, which I didn't even know then, John. And he had come with us from Port Elizabeth. And Denise made some serious suicide attempts, and I climbed in through her window and found her. And remember her father breaking down the bathroom door and her being covered in blood. She eventually committed suicide 2 weeks before my mother's mother died, who was being nursed in my bed in Johannesburg. This was when I'd just qualified. And I'd also just became engaged then. I was working as a senior research bursar for the South African Institute for Scientific and Industrial Research in the lipid metabolic laboratory under Godfrey Getz, working with Arthur Rubinstein, one of WITS's most distinguished alumni, and Arthur had this publish or perish mentality, and Godfrey Getz was brilliant. But we had I called him Jaime Globe and H.B. Stein, who came to Israel, and he wouldn't he thought I'd started research after winning a prize for an essay in third or fourth year. I also edited the Leech and organized some conferences. Leech was a medical school and senior people's publication. I'd reclassified hyperbilirubinemia as jaundice of childhood, a different classification to Sheila Sherlock, the famous one, but related to it. And I was interested in proving that the metabolic pathway for the excretion of antibiotics and zinc, a trace element from the kidneys, was the same, and that zinc metabolism was very important in heart, because it's a chelating agent. It has 4 prongs, and that if you gave dechelating agents, you might be able to help the metabolic disease of the heart that had African prisoners in our South African jails then, probably still, and kwashiorkor, which we saw a lot of, the starvation disease, and the enlarged the enlarged heart, the liver disease, the enlarged hearts, where there were women who were giving birth to their 5th child, and they were dying of heart failure a little bit after they'd fed the child a bit. When I was prem in Port Elizabeth, I was given extra breast milk from a breast pump when my mother was so ill, and I was nursed in a shoebox next to a fire like this one, and with all kinds of women who were not necessarily white. My father saw to that, and it was illegal. And so I was very interested in it, because I've been told many times about my premature birth. And once when I was in South Africa, in London, my very first medical job was at the Richmond and Kew Gardens. There was a hospital which had a psychotherapy and child psychiatry department, and
so Judith, you've actually encountered a lot of death and dying growing up.
I had deaths regularly, almost every year. I mean, when I went to school, started high school, the girl I'd been playing hockey with, practicing with, who I liked, who had one green eye and one brown eye, she was hit by a car right after and killed. And I saw it.
You witnessed
I witnessed the accident. My whole life I kept seeing these things. My back got injured when I climbed up, was the tiniest in the class. I shot up the double-story gym. It was an Olympic gym. And it was before Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came, when they got married, before they became, when her father came to tour the Commonwealth, and we saw that. No, that was when I was younger. I had been in Johannesburg. But I was back in Johannesburg from Durban, and I climbed this climbing frame, and I looked down. I was the tiniest, and I was there and nobody else was. So I looked down, opened my mouth, didn't hold on, and I fell 2 stories onto my feet and jarred my back. And the next day I leaned down to put on my boots to go to hockey practice, and I threw a disc. But it was also in the middle of a polio epidemic, and I'm not sure that I didn't get polio and waste muscles, because friends did get polio. And I have a very weak lower back, need the support. And I was in this brace, and the kids used to tap it and laugh at me and mock me.
So you had not such a simple upbringing. You've had a lot of challenges along the way.
I had, and I didn't know. I never had friends. I didn't really make friends except for Norma. I mean, I was friendly with everyone. Lots of girls had crushes on me, just like I'd had a crush on some woman when I got to the school, who was sort of our swimming instructor, but I wasn't allowed to swim, or I could only swim on my back. Backstroke, in life-saving stroke. I've got a life-saving certificate.
And can I ask, Judith, when did you decide to come to Israel?
Well, I told you, I always wanted to come to Israel, and I always thought my father would have come to Israel.
And your mother, was she also?
My mother was dependent on her younger sister and her younger sister's husband, and worked in his shop, and I always wanted her to go to university, and she always said, no, it's not for her, she's got to be home to be with us, and she was.
So what year did you come to Israel? What year did you make
67.
You came in 57, you were...
57, but I decided I was... it was the Yom Kippur War, and I was out with a now very distinguished non-Jewish...
the Yom Kippur War was in 73. So maybe in 67 was the Six-Day War.
Six-Day War, I mean.
Okay, and you came to Israel in the Six-Day War?
Sure. I was out with this guy, it was Yom Kippur... no, both wars. Yeah.
The Six-Day War in 67.
My mother, that was very traumatic. I'd just written, I was supposed to finish my psychoanalytic training, and they made me Derek Miller, who England wasn't big enough for him anymore. He needed to go to America suddenly. And he took off to set up psychiatry in Chicago.
So Judith, growing up, did you always feel a connection with Israel?
Yeah, I told you, we had this little box, and we put our Keren Kayemit, we put money there, and everybody talked about Israel and coming to Israel. and some of them had been here and then gone on. We had some relative, I think, grandfather perhaps, who came, took one look at Hula and building roads and got malaria or something, and went straight to South Africa. There wasn't much work for a watchmaker in South Africa. He didn't want to go to South America, and my grandmother, that one's brothers, were already in South Africa. They started importing fruit and vegetables, and they controlled the fruit and vegetable market for Cape Town.
Wow.
They walked with eggs from one side to the other side and sold, at a penny or so profit, and in the end they controlled a whole lot. Hirschman's, and we had cousins there. My cousins, the numbers of them that were killed in car accidents or shootings in Cape Town, in Namibia, in Windhoek. And I have an uncle on my mother's side, Jack Kolakowski, who's mentioned in Inside Africa, and he took a truck and he went into the middle of Zululand, and he actually, we were there when the king of Zululand, I went back with him and my mother and his son, and on the back of a truck with goats all across Zululand. Remember that very well. And we arrived in the main kraal place, and the king came and he said, "Wow, Boss Jack, Boss Jack."
Wow.
And they fell into each other's arms. And he had actually taught the guy to speak English and Afrikaans and to read, and helped him to go and get an education. And my cousin Selwyn, his son, Collie, who's still alive and in America somewhere now, or Canada, with one of his sons who's a computer expert and whose daughter's professor of pediatric neonatology and research, where somewhere Michigan maybe, or maybe it's MIT or Brown or Dartmouth, I don't remember. Selwyn, they were all very, very tall men, the Kolakowskis, and they were in the king's bodyguard. The king's bodyguard in Russia, the last king who got all killed. And he and his brother Ruvain, whose two sons also were very interesting people, and one of whom was Kenny, who went out with my stepsister Denise, who wanted to marry him, but she was about 14. And far from a good girl. She was very promiscuous, and her father was furious with her. She was very beautiful, and she threw herself under a bus, and that she's buried very close to where my mother had a plot, and next to where her mother is buried in Johannesburg.
Sure, it's traumatic, all what you've been through.
Don't talk. I mean, it's amazing and very traumatic, and I'm very
Judith,
traumatized.
when you came to Israel, when did you finally make Aliyah? You came with your mother?
67, I came with Derek. Derek wanted then, he'd been my boss. He left me to choose what job I wanted at the Tavistock. He left me his practice. That's what I chose because it was most interesting. So I actually had one of the highest ranking ministers in the British government. I saw even the Prime Minister's son, and they were all in my practice. I had some Nobel Prize winning people's son. I worked in the Science and Society Council, helped set it up. I gave evidence on police commissions. I ran groups for prison psychiatrists and senior governors, but of places like Broadmoor and the women's prisons, and these commissions of inquiry were with the most distinguished people, and I was the secretary, and I learned so much from them. I knew nothing about any of this. I remember taking over from Derek, and I took over, then Donald Winnicott died, my great mentor, and I took over. I got so many referrals from his wife and him, and I was a go-between between Winnicott and, he called himself the most disgraced man, Prince Raj Muhammad Masood Raj Khan, who was nothing more than some landowner from Pakistan, but very brilliant and very much a psychopath, who seduced many patients and ran around with Saudi princesses and the Princess of Green. Oh, how's this? I treated a couple. He's a descendant of the Saadia Gaon, and she, a direct descendant, and she was supposed to become the princess, the Shah's wife. And they were with me for couples therapy. And I traced their genealogy, that they were both very much not. And what stories they had. And she'd grown up in the Punjab. And they lived very quietly in the south of France. She was an alcoholic. And he was a wine merchant.
And how many years were you involved in this clinic?
I remained a psychoanalyst until about 20 years ago, and I'm still in touch with lots of patients, ex-patients, all of whom have made contributions, all of whom I learned a hell of a lot from.
And Judith, why did you decide to leave England?
Because I wanted to be in Israel. And I came with Derek, who said if I didn't come and be with him, that I should be here. I'd earlier been on group relations training. I'm also group relations training qualified to lead analyst, and I'm a group analyst, and I'm trained in family therapy, and I'm trained in couples therapy, and I'm trained in international, and I'm a member of, properly trained, international conflict resolution and management training. I used to attend seminars on the interaction of non-government organizations and governmental institutions. I was on Jimmy Carter's international select group of trauma experts that toured South Africa. I was invited by the Conciliation Council. One of the councillors who I was friendly with, who recognized me in the group, said, "What are you doing there? Get up here and give my lecture," and to work with the group, and I did.
This was the Truth and Reconciliation.
I worked and trained I worked with some of them, and they wanted me to come back to South Africa, and I was interviewed for the job of developing psychiatric and trauma centers and suicide programs and all kinds of mental health programs for South Africa. I was interviewed over the phone, and then they asked me the question, "Were you ever a member of the ANC?" I said, "No, I'm apolitical." "Were you ever a communist?" "No, I'm apolitical." why would you come back here? I said, my mother is still living in South Africa. She's English. She's ill. I'd very much like to spend the remaining years with her. Are you prepared to remain in South Africa? I don't know. I'm Israeli. You're Israeli? I'm also Israeli, yes. I'm English and Israeli and South African. Enough. No, you won't do. And they appointed somebody who knew sweet nothing. And you know what services are like in South Africa.
I think the head of the Truth and Reconciliation was Desmond Tutu.
I met them all.
Who was
but was that anti-Semite Desmond Tutu?
No, he was very anti-Israel, extremely.
Very anti-Israel. And I was asked to give and gave the first address to the entire health and public health and something or other international institution. I gave the first public address in Johannesburg. It was recorded. My lectures internationally, I've lectured everywhere, and I did all of this on the Te'ud, and my other was I led a delegation to Egypt. Jill Straker was professor of psychology and psychotherapy at Wits. She left for Australia, and Yvonne Blake before her, and Deanna Schmuckler after her. I was friendly with all of them. We had, after medical school, a really remarkable group that met with Professor Eddie Roux, who was a communist but socialist. But he was an ecologist and a climatologist, and he was our first year lecturer that made the most impression on me. And I've been a dedicated environmentalist with principles and climate and all this, actually since my father's day. Because he started soil erosion. He was interested in its causes and effects and how it happened, and also citrus farming. And I remember there was a big drought and then floods. We got stuck in the floods, had to be carried to safety, and the jeep being washed away, and this tidal wave coming. I mean, I've seen amazing
You really
things.
have.
Yeah.
Judith, with your background, your incredible, not only academic, your degrees and your experience. So when you came to Israel, what was the impetus, or what caused you to get involved
I had
with the survivors?
this group relations training thing. I behaved in different ways. I became involved with a man who designed and saw the problems with the Rolls-Royce engines, Roger Kistrup, whose brother was an Antarctic explorer, engineer, drilled down under the ice. I learned all sorts of things. Roger was a mathematician and professor of business management studies later, when he resigned from Rolls-Royce at Warwick University. We had, it was very painful because he was married, but we handled the group. We were instant rapport and fell in love. And I'd just been very traumatized because when I left South Africa, I was engaged to be married, but we decided both to get treatment. It was connected with my having been raped while on duty at Tara and not being able to discuss it with my fiancé, feeling completely damaged. He was a very psychopathic lawyer, and a whole notorious thing. Simon Myerson, quite a notorious case in those days, who brought down his whole family. And I don't want to talk about it. But I felt damaged. I very much am a woman's sort of... woman's very much fight for anything to do with women's rights and freedoms, and very against all the nonsense that's going on.
And can I just ask, with your training, could you psychoanalyze yourself, or could you understand?
I've been a diarist, writing to my grandmother. My mother made me from the age of 6. I mean, I started diarizing my life before Anais Nin was even born, and I continue to this day. This computer and downstairs, and my diaries and everything, up to a point where I was living in the archives, 2, 3, or 4 archives have parts of my work, and until they shut down archives in England, the PETT, Planned Environmental Trust, Total Environments, their archives, the archives of psychoanalysis at Birmingham University, till that shut, the psychoanalytic archives themselves, where they destroyed some of the documents when they moved buildings, and I have some stuff down below, and the British Library has some of my archives, and the what's the name of that? There's another one, but there's lots of my work, but no, who'll ever go scrawling through all that, hard copies or other copies.
So Judith,
I also paint, and I also write poetry, and I always do whatever I'm doing full out. So there are drawings and paintings there that are by me. And
Judith, can I ask you, your interest in interviewing survivors when you came to Israel?
Yeah.
What was the impetus for you to meet survivors? Did you feel a kinship?
I knew them, and I was interviewing them even before I came to Israel. Was doing it in England.
Did you do it for any organization or voluntary?
I did everything voluntarily. I spent lots of my money on voluntary things. I also, when I led this delegation to Jill Straker, I was telling you, there was a meeting on human rights and human needs, and it was in Germany. Very difficult for me to go to Germany. I sort of had to forgive the trees first. I couldn't believe things. I was invited to Germany to lecture by a woman, Laura Schacht, who was a great friend of the great ballet master from Holland, and a very interesting woman, and she'd been suicidal, and I'd introduced her to someone called Ray Shepherd, who was one of the editors of Winnicott. I have to say that I trained with some of the greatest analysts ever, and I met them all, and I worked with them all, and I'd met some here in England, and I had no doubt I was coming here after working with all of them, but when I finished, and I think everyone encouraged me, including Rosenberg and I've got I just have to name all the main British analysts. You know that the Israeli Society was founded by a British Jew who was an All scholar, but also a general and fought with Wingate. And Winnicott was a great admirer of Lawrence of Arabia with his first wife. And I was a lot Winnicott's confidant. I got into trouble in the training when one of my patients committed suicide because I had said to him, I've written a paper about this, which, I don't know, I think it's still quoted. I've got about 35 different topics, different books and papers that are cited on the Academia Edu, and I all the time hear that people I've never heard of are making use of them and reading them and teaching them. I've got one book here I can give you which tells about me quite a lot. That's about Winnicott and Bowlby, but I merely edited it. I wrote 14 other scholarly books and cross-referenced them. I wrote 2 novels, I wrote many short stories, and I had 4 more books of poetry ready, actually 7, and they were all fed and put not into the right truck, and the people who were supposed to send them to me, they were all boxed and ready and labelled. They saw them being fed in the rain while they were unpacking into a dump which was picked up, and they saw them all being chewed up. And that's it. And my hard copies and Conchi discs all got destroyed here, and the papers. It's very traumatic. So some of the stuff that was published on the internet exists, but the internet's not going to exist forever. And all my backup discs, they kept changing, the speeds and the languages, and they weren't necessarily compatible. It's all downstairs, and it's a hell of a mess downstairs. It'll take forever. And my certificates, I had them all, and letters of recommendation. I thought once to apply. A survivor who was with me on various times and who asked me to interview and set up the Long Island group, and Judith Issroff had this delusional idea, Judith, that she could make a map of what was happening on what day in what camp all over all these thousands of camps in the Holocaust. She wanted that project, and I said it's crazy. And there was and I interviewed her in Long Island. This was 61.
And you interviewed a lot of survivors in Israel? A lot of...
Everybody you met on the bus was a survivor. You talk to them and interview them and invite them home.
Would you go to their homes?
Yes, I did. And I have had after that, at one stage, tremendous guilt because I didn't have time. I couldn't go in. They had spilled their lives to me. They told me things that nobody ever told to anyone. My secretary, I recorded with their permission. The secretary just gave up and broke the tapes and had a breakdown. I can tell you some of the stories, not the names. The one twin, I interviewed one of Mengele's twins who led the twins out and all the way to Israel. I was friendly from my very first meeting of psychoanalysts when I was just accepted as a student. It was in 1957. I'd just come from, or I was just going to a cousin's wedding in England to be a bridesmaid. And I was immensely young, and I was with a survivor called Charlotte Balkany, who'd been in Theresienstadt, who was from, I think, Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, or Hungary. She was from, like Barland, Michael Barland. I mean, all my main teachers were survivors. Or Winnicott, who was very aware of the Shoah and no denier of it, and man's evil. So Michael Barland, Charlotte Balkany walked in, and we were in student quarters, and we had to share 2 bunks and a table in the middle, and she took one look at me. She was absolutely horrified. She wanted a room on her own, and we became very good friends and remained very good friends. And she told me her story. That picture there is by her sister, Balkany, who was an artist in Paris. This one, yeah. The next one is mine, and the one above it is mine.
So this is by Balkany's sister.
What?
This beautiful picture is
Closer. Yeah. Those 2, the colour one at the top and the one next below it, the still life, are by me. This one here is the one I'm talking about with the spirals.
Yeah.
That's Suzanne Balkany. A most remarkable woman.
And was she a survivor as well?
Of course. The whole family had perished but for them. And one other sister Suzanne was in Paris, and Charlotte sent me to her, and I stayed with her. She lived in one tiny room with hangings. She could barely eat. She had this fish tank with beautiful fish with fluorescent, and she painted and she taught, and survivors came to her. So I knew their stories, and they brought the deaf and dumb children they walked them, they brought them here, they were on the exodus. So I met some of them because I took Charlotte around. She talked sign language, and she was with the Anna Freud, a lot of people. I was more Winnicottian, and we cross-talked. She was amazing. But Michael Bolland and Eva Rosenfeld wanted me to come here, and I met her husband, who was a conductor in England and a survivor, and they told me their stories. And I interviewed Paula Hyman, my own analyst, at one stage, and she told me her story. And Alice Barland and Michael Barland and Rosemary Gordon, the Jungian, and Anna-Marie Sandler, and Alan, well, Freud himself was a survivor, and Princess Marie Bonaparte. I interviewed the great artist and his daughter. The films were made about them. One of them was a curator of the Anna Freud Institute and the Anna Freud Museum. I interviewed other survivors who had come on the Kinder transport, and Ruth Rigby, and her husband, who was a survivor from Lebanon, or his family. And I analyzed Yoel Arika, who brought the Jews of Iraq and Iran out, and Algeria and Jerba. And I interviewed the survivors from Jerba, and Baha'i people. My home in London, 57 Hampstead Hill Gardens, a flat that I went to, it was the home of the Baha'is. They now own the whole place, and the head of the Baha'is, the daughter who became the head, was my neighbor. So I was friendly with Baha'i here, and I heard them and went, and their kibbutz was next to a kibbutz, Moshav Shitufi, where there were 2 survivors of the Exodus. They came here and lived here for 5 days. It was the first time they'd ever been in an ordinary, they thought it was ordinary, Israeli home, eaten, met the neighbors, talked to the neighbors. They never had a chance before that. I heard their stories. On the Exodus with them was a survivor of Bobby Yar. I went to a kind of little hole in the wall where this survivor was, with a little brazier. He was a beggar. He didn't have a proper bed or a toilet. There was a woman who used to help him. She told me her story of Teresa Stutz. She'd been a violinist. She gave me a jersey that she'd got of somebody who then died. Every time I would drive past these places, I would feel sick that I couldn't go in and see them and bring them with me. But I was busy. I was invited here first on this group relations training. There were some people from Oranim, the training institute at Oranim, and the kibbutz movement that was socialist, and they were responsible for the conflict resolution and mental health programs for the whole of the north of Israel. And they sent me a letter. They said, this will be like a preemptive strike. We want you to come here. We've invited a number of people. We would like you to come and speak for us and be with them and visit the kibbutzim, and we would like to offer you a job as the chief psychiatrist and trainer because you have the psychiatric degree for Oranim. And I went and I interviewed them. They were all survivors.
And you accepted the job?
I couldn't. I still had people in. I said I have to finish off with my cases here in London. I can't do to them what Derek Miller did to his patients that I inherited, and Winnicott dying did to his patients, because I had this astonishing practice. And I just couldn't do it. I had filled up the people in many different friends. Then
what did you do with the testimonies that you heard? Did you ever write it up, or?
Yeah, I was writing it up. I told you, my secretary.
Did you ever publish? Was it ever published?
No, I can't publish without permission. Some is down below. But then I got involved with Satanistic ritual abuse. And I got involved with theologians. I was invited to a World Conference of Human Rights and Human Needs. A man called Paul Sieghart, who I call a psychopath on behalf of society. Paul heard me talk to I inherited Derek Miller's many lectures all over London. You know, I was very young, and the first of those, I travelled to some part of South London, or Kent it was, Sussex. And his wife was then, having been tennis champion of England, Felicity Ann. She was his second wife. His first wife had died. And he stayed when he heard me start talking. And I just spoke about being the odd one out and not fitting in at school, and doing several things on my own and taking extra subjects. I took extra subjects for matric. I got an A aggregate because I took extra subjects, not because I got so many distinctions. I never bothered to SWAT or anything like that. I was too busy living. And there was a polio epidemic, and then I was too ill.
So how did you get involved with the satanic
Isle of Man? My boss was one, and I had some cases, absolutely horrific. I was so traumatized, and I had to run for my life. I had to be hidden, and I stayed with my Katie Smith, my housekeeper, and I was getting these amazing patients, some from the mafia, from America, on my practice. And I was working, Paul Sieghart had a small select group of all scholars, historians, mathematicians, most distinguished in their fields, musicians, and he thought they would all unite. I would be his, what he called his original red-headed woman, meaning they would be all so fed up with me, with my thoughts going in many directions, when they were all ordered scholars, that they would unite against me and allow him to do what he wanted to do. This is a paper published in Nature, which is a very prestigious journal, and Paul published it under his own name, and then at the bottom with the assistance of, and there he listed all of our names.
And Judith, can I just ask, when you went to visit the survivors and you did the interviews, so a lot of the survivors, in my experience, they haven't told their families because they didn't want to traumatize their families.
That's true.
But
when I went round, I was kind of translating for two British secret servicemen who came to inform the Israelis, who already knew. They'd been working with the British Secret Service in Northern Ireland, where I worked for 2 years, and boy, I interviewed survivors there. The ones who were in Northern Ireland, and became very friendly with them. But that's another story, and there's Satanism there, and what happens in Satanism is very similar to what happened with the British torturers and the other groups, partisan groups living in Belfast. Imagine living in Belfast. I was there for 2 bit years, and I ran the outpatient clinics and the inpatient adolescent units. And I saw from children and all their parents, and I used to do home visits, and they were from all different groups.
This is
And
when you
their
had
parents were the ones in prison, and their parents were the ones in parliament, and their parents were leading, and there you had to know which direction to drive or you'd go into the wrong area. It's just like what's happening here now is Northern Ireland at the height of terrorism. And there I had one satanistically, ritually abused boy who tried to strangle me while I was sitting on talking to him, and pulled out a knife and tried to stab me. Fortunately, I had guards on the door, and they managed to restrain him. And then he tried to strangle me again when I went for a walk with him in the botanical gardens from behind. Yeah, and then another one escaped, and we found her in a hole, but very similar to Holocaust survivors. And there were Holocaust survivors.
And with the Holocaust survivors, did they open up to you? They opened up?
I'm a skilled, trained listener. What is psychoanalysis other than learning how to listen?
And would you let them speak, or did you ask them a lot of questions?
No, I let them tell me their stories, but I would start with dream analysis, because or squiggles. I'd play a game, something quite different, and let their stories come out. And believe me, every other person in Northern Ireland has got a story to tell.
So you've been in many conflict areas as well.
Oh, absolutely. Nothing like Belfast, nothing like even Edinburgh.
And in South Africa during apartheid as well.
And Swaziland, or Lesotho, whoa. I remember taking my aunts and my mother to visit Mujaji, the Rain Queen's kraal. No, it was a Nidabeli kraal. I used to have here, they were stolen, a shillelagh from Northern Ireland, a beautiful stick with the snakes intertwined, carved from a piney bush, that I was given at about 5 o'clock one morning in the middle of this kraal area. Kossisi, for you, will keep you safe.
It's a pity it was stolen.
But no, I've got some stones still, but and a sling. And Mujaji was friendly with my best friend. I did have a best friend. Her name was Wendy Winter, and she was an expert on Bushman art, and she travelled with Philip Tobias and Martin Bobrow and a delegation to live with the Bushmen and Adam Cooper in the Kalahari. And she'd come back. I've got an ostrich egg decorated, and a special necklace also. That's from her. And I had a Bushman pouch with a Bushman arrow. They send the arrow into the bum, right, and the labia. And she'd learnt some Bushman, and I was the person she told that she had kidney failure, and they had to remove her kidneys because some British doctors just thought it was an ordinary infection and didn't treat it properly. And she had been a pentathlon champion representing South Africa, well, representing really Swaziland, And she was a great athlete, and she was the longest lived person on the very first artificial kidney. And I was there for all of her kidney transplants and her rejection of them. And she used to write to me and then tear it up. So I know about writing therapy. And I have some of her last letters. And her husband, Ralph, who became homosexual, he was student council at Wits, and he was arrested. And he managed to write to me about her death and about that he was in jail, could I do anything? And I did a hell of a lot from here to make sure that his secret arrest was made public, and that, contacted Tobias. Philip was a friend of mine. I used to go out with him. He took me and my mother out, and he wanted me to come back and be a professor between the medical school and Wits, to bring some culture and breadth of thought and ideas going in all directions to Wits. I was very friendly with Barry, who I think might still be there, Barry Zinn, whose brother runs Kibbutz Sora. He's professor of biology. He turned on the lights and destroyed his PhD because he was doing some form of X-ray examination of.
And Judith, did you know like the likes of the Shamroth?
Sure, I knew Shamroth. I worked with Shamroth. I learnt cardiology from Shamroth.
These are
mainly Harry Cecil Sefton.
And Harry Sefton?
He and I were best friends.
So Harry Sefton, he taught us as well. Harry Sefton taught us, and he told us something which I've never forgotten. He said, I want all you to know, all the students to know, that one day you're going to be prescribing, just know that every medication has a side effect. And try use more natural if you can. And those simple words, it had such a deep impression on us.
I learned how to work with. There was another doctor who'd been an ordinary GP to the Kruger National Park. There's a tribe there that if your feet leave the ground and you die with your feet not on the ground, you can never reach your spiritual ancestors. But they believed in all kinds of magic, and he had a way of treating people who were dying of shock. Now, I had a patient who, in the ward of the Johannesburg General Hospital, Professor Elliott's ward, he died of nothing, because she heard that somebody was walking in her footsteps near Windhoek in the middle of the Namibian desert. Somebody had walked in her footsteps. This was the message she got. She went white. Her pulse went mad, her blood pressure went mad, and she died of shock. And at post-mortem, there was nothing that could be found, except, a little bit of overwork of her adrenals. So,
can I just ask?
We called boss or whatever. Right. That had me very puzzled.
Right.
So from that day on, she and a woman called Mrs. Danzig, whom I loved, an old Yiddish woman who I was most embarrassed about because I couldn't understand her Yiddish and she couldn't understand the two words I knew, and she spoke also some Russian. And I knew from my educated grandmother Ponimaya nicht Rusit. I don't speak Russian. And I mean, I only spoke this language that was this grandmother's language. And what I learned from my dear Teresa, this Swazi princess, Southern Sutu, chieftainess.
Can I ask, Judith, did you keep in touch with the alumni, with the Wits from your medical school?
I kept in touch with Perry Leary, who's
and
most
in Israel, have you kept in touch
No,
with?
he's in Ireland.
But in Israel, have you kept in touch with any of your classmates or people that you qualified
No, I
with?
don't keep. Avi Baxt. Yes, Avi Baxt in Netanya, but he's too busy now. But I was in touch with him and his sister, Sheila Safa and David. They're the only people, but they're not my class.
But
Avi is my class.
when you look back, you had Margaret Isaacson, you had major
Margaret Isaacson I never was in touch with.
and Rubinoff, Professor
That's not
Rubinoff.
my class.
I know, but did you still keep a connection, or did you?
Arthur Rubenstein I met when I went and stayed with them, but he wasn't my class, he was the class ahead. I of course went to Michael Ronsel, professor at Harvard. I contacted Jeff Mazels when Carol, his first wife, died. He's now remarried again happily. I think he's had a stroke though. Wolfie Rakusen when I went, when I was in the Cape. Clive Noble was the one I kept in touch with. What a remarkable man. I loved Clive. He was a houseman for Professor Duplessis when I was, and Anthony Rankin, who lived next door to me, who was also a houseman then, and Ari Groesbeek, who committed suicide. His wife Anne had this, when I got in touch with the Broederbond and I heard them talking about Cesar Hewitt, and Anne got into trouble for inviting me. Or Ari got into trouble for inviting me to come with him when he was too shocked to drive. And I was ostracized and treated like I was a spy. And that was the same day Verwoerd got shot. And Norma Siegel and Eric Friedberg took him in and treated him, and then went into absolute ethical dilemmas. Why hadn't they finished him off? What a mitzvah that would have been, and what should one do in such...
He was the architect of apartheid.
Yeah. But also there was a guy in our class who is never spoken about and didn't graduate with us. There were two interesting ones. Claude E. Newberry, Catholic, Roman Catholic, very ethical, and he became public health administrator for Johannesburg, but he had 9 daughters, all Catholic, right? And I met Claude, and Claude refused to have anything to do with the Wits alumni. And another one, the day, Peter Pannell, lovely, sweet guy, who went to work with Schweitzer in Africa, became an eye doctor. Sure, I kept in touch with him, but I went with him and Ari to his wedding at Lamborghini with Erika Sutter, who I also kept in touch with a little bit, and saw in Basel when I went there. She was a remarkable woman. She played the cello da gamba, much older, about 40-something. And she became an eye specialist and worked also with Schweitzer for many years. So, none of them kind of made headlines, but Eric Friedlander was a footballer.
But looking back, there was Monty Zion. I mean, we had
Who?
Monty Zion, who came here.
Zion was a teacher of mine.
There
too.
was Professor Levy, Pets. I mean, we had some amazing
I know, but
people that
I
came.
used to see them all on Sundays playing tennis and playing court to my cousin Helene Pussy, who died terribly. She died in the month of her pregnancy from a staph septicemia at the Royal Free Hospital. And the letter to me to book her a place and to be ready, came after she died. Very traumatic. And her brother Neville Catson, the famous Neville Catson tennis player, lovely guy, came. I was just supporting him, howling his head off at the moon about her death, and why hadn't he they did a tracheostomy on her as she was dying, because her husband, who had given her the staph septicemia and the flu, and she'd had discarded the baby. It all happened sort of within 2 days at the Royal Free Hospital. So that was terribly traumatic, and we were all grieving. And this husband, Bernie, he became Dean of Surgery and Dean of the Canteen of Harvard. Yale.
Amazing.
Not Harvard, Yale. And he wouldn't let us have anything to do with my godson, Simon Lytton, who's now living in Germany because his wife had to go, who's Jewish. They met at the Weizmann Institute. They're both brilliant scientists, and he does editing and writing and so on, and works in Bangladeshis at present. Takes different projects and presents them and is the last name on it. For a salary, he writes up these people's work who don't speak English properly, and Germans, and translates it. But he is so confused, he is so crazy, he's so damaged, because his father came after he'd been 4 years in South Africa, and I'd been spending my spare time and bringing my fiancé, Henry Bates, who's a great computer polymath and a lovely guy, and I've had some remarkable affairs, but I mean, Henry could have stayed with all my life very happily. He's became Dean of Students at Michigan Ann Arbor University, and he wrote a lot of the languages that are used in all the computers, the stuff that we work today. But there wasn't anything he didn't do. Skiing, flying planes. We crash landed.
You've had such an eventful life. It's incredible.
Yeah,
it really is.
Certainly never been.
Judith, you've never been bored. You've never been bored. I'm sure you've never been bored.
I've never been. Well, I have been bored. Of course, I've been bored.
No, but what a full life you've. It's incredible what you've experienced.
Yeah, I haven't told you about Taikan Joji. His portrait is around the corner if you have a look. He's a Rinzai Zen master, and he taught me meditation, and he is the actual founder and bringer of Rinzai Zen School of Buddhism to France, and we're still in contact. He phones from time to time. See it on the floor there? Mm-hmm. Or the wall?
Yeah.
Strange looking fellow, right?
Well, Judith, I just want to ask you, with all your life experience and what you've gone through, and you really have gone through
trauma.
Not only trauma, but you've overcome trauma. You've done
that was all from my cancers and cancer fog, and I was completely crazy then. and it's taken me about 20 years
But
to
you're
recover my
remarkable.
sanity.
You really are.
And
You're remarkable, Judith. What message do you impart to the next generation? And from your experience, your life experience, what advice would you give the youngsters of today?
that you should do what your instincts tell you to do, and always listen to somebody else. The more you know, the more area will be exposed to ignorance. So you'll never know anything, and when you know enough, you know that very well. To try to make friends and respect others, and you'll be surprised what you'll learn from somebody else. You may be sure that you know what's happened, but you can't really tell anybody anything, because people won't actually understand or remember until they themselves are ready to discover what you have to impart. I spent my life being very obsessively scholarly for 35 years. I wrote day and night and read, and but I didn't know anything about the publishing business. I didn't know it was a business. I didn't know that what I was trying to put into one book should be in perhaps 12 books. I turned down all kinds of opportunities. Gerald Kaplan brought me here to be the professor of child psychotherapy and child psychiatry here, and run the department for him when he took off to write books at Hadassah and Karim. And I turned it down, and I was the supervisor of Joe Zayas, and I always was trying to help other people. It's not good to be altogether selfless. I was more involved in what I was doing than I should have been. I set up the booth for Holocaust survivors with Ruth Fleischhauer joined me on the first day, and we've been firm friends ever since. And the people who were officially interviewing them, they couldn't tell these young people who were themselves children of survivors, and they used to come out of there, this was in 1981 at the first international gathering, and come straight to us and tell us their message, or whatever it was. And Ruth, herself a survivor, did not want me to publish what I wanted to publish straight afterwards, which were some of these testimonies and lessons we had learned. I learned that when you think you can do no more, you can do more. I learned that perhaps you should always take something symbolic by way of payment. I saw that people who were survivors were enacting what they had done. Those who had changed identities kept coming back with new identities to our booth. People will enact what they can't vocalize. So if you can be aware for yourself and contain things, if you can compromise, you will be strong, because you will know that what's past nothing can be done about, but what's to come you can maybe do something about. And there are some things that you just have to accept. Nothing can be done about. You just have to endure them. But life is good. Use your imagination. There are far more things you can learn from others that you don't expect than you can learn from yourself. And I advocate writing therapy and writing down some words of wisdom from somebody else that you can quote every day, and try to laugh every day and try to make a friend every day. Do something decent, because in the end you live with your own conscience. Nobody knows what you've done or what you haven't done, so you first have to forgive yourself for everything you haven't done. No point in poisoning yourself with guilt or shame or embarrassment. That's about it.
So Judith, I just want to thank you.
I hope...
I'm so grateful to you, Judith. You have no idea. This has been... it's been such an honor and a privilege to be with you. I really...
We'll come back.
I'm extremely grateful. I know we can go on, and your life is... Just look at your books and you look at what you've achieved, and you are remarkable, and you should just be well. And
it's nice to hear it.
No, it really is.
I don't feel it, because I, in fact, had the privilege of being with truly remarkable people.
You really have. And you know, the names and the people that you've met that have throughout your life, it's just, these are the greats. You've been with the greats, and you are one of the greats. And,
no,
and
I'm not
I
one
feel
of the
very
greats. I
privileged.
must have been had I published all those books.
It's a pity that the testimonies that you didn't publish. It's a pity, because all those lessons from the people that spoke to you, it's so important.
What I worked out from theologians, from,
Well, maybe we'll go through it. Maybe we can
I
remember.
want to do that.
Maybe we can, because it's a pity those gems to be lost. And you're just amazing person, and you should continue just to be well, and I'm grateful for the time you've given.
What I've been asking for, because this is all torn, and dislocated, and I can't type for long.
So maybe we can work out something on a video. It's wonderful, because this is a way that we can...
That's what I've been asking for.
Well, be well, and Chag Sameach, and really thank you very, very much, Judith.
Chag Sameach to you. Enjoy your daughter.
Thank you so much, Judith.
Grandchildren.